Today I'm going to talk about a subject that I have covered before in another podcast, but it was a while ago, and that is the exposure triangle, and I'm also going to mention modes in the camera. So, as I've said, I've covered this before, but I think it's one of the most important things to understand when it comes to getting the most from your DSLR, your mirrorless camera, whatever you're using, where you have control over each element of the exposure triangle. And it's one of those things that I think some people shy away from. And the reason they do that is there are a lot of numbers, and it can look quite daunting if you just look at the numbers. So what I'm going to use, and if you've heard me speak about this before, I'm going to use the same example that I've used before. But it's just like driving a car. So if you drive a car, when you think about it, there are actually all sorts of relationships that you could think about that you have to know. The one I'm going to talk about is what happens when you put down on the throttle, on the gas, on the accelerator, if you're listening in the UK. So what happens is you put your foot down, more fuel goes into the engine if it's a petrol or a diesel car. I'm excluding electric vehicles at this point. And then what also happens is you change your range. So what I mean by that is how far you can go on the fuel that you currently have in your vehicle. So that's a relationship, and I'm sure none of that came as any particular surprise to you. And that's all we're really looking at with the exposure triangle, but we can start to complicate it a bit, because when we look at the example of the vehicle, of the car, you have pressure on the throttle, the accelerator, the gas pedal, whatever you want to call it, and you might measure that in pounds or newtons or whatever it might be. But I'm pretty sure most people listening anyway won't have any idea what that number is, and I certainly don't when I drive my car. The other things I've said is when you put your foot down, you have more fuel going into the engine. So if we think of the flow rate, let's say that's in litres per second, and I'm just grabbing a way of measuring it out of the air, but there'll be some sort of way you can measure the quantity of fuel that's going in over a certain time. So whether it's litres per second or something else, doesn't really matter. But that number obviously will change as you put more fuel into the engine, into the carburetor, whatever you've got, fuel injection system, and that number changes. Now, again, I'm guessing that most people won't have the first clue about what those numbers are, and I certainly don't when it comes to my car. The number that I hope you're familiar with is the speed you're going, because if you're not familiar with that, that can cause a bit of distress and also some fines. So you probably know whether it's miles per hour or kilometers per hour, whatever it is, but you'll see the changing speed. You've got a speedo there. It'll tell you how fast you're going, and you can see immediately the change that putting your foot down has. So, and as I've said, that also impacts your range. So the other factor there, in fact, I've now added a fourth factor to what I was talking about. But that other factor is how far can you go if you keep your foot in the same place now. So if you're driving on a motorway, a freeway, an auto route, whatever you're driving on, and you just keep your foot in that position, how far can you go before you run out of fuel? And that distance will be less than it will be when you had less pressure on the pedals. So that's another variable that you probably would have some idea about, whether it's 50 miles, 100 miles, 100 Ks, whatever it might be. So I hope you're getting the idea of this, though. The point is that you understand all of this stuff pretty instinctively, but you don't actually need to know what the numbers are. And this is the point I'm really trying to get across when it comes to the exposure triangle, because the variables there are fixed. You have your shutter speed, you have your aperture, and you have your sensitivities. So you've got shutter speed in, what fraction of a second that the shutter is open, might be a thousandth of a second, a hundredth. It might be several seconds if you're doing a long exposure. You've got the aperture. And I'm not even going to talk about where the numbers come from. Now, as you know, I do, or I hope you know, I do an online photography course. It starts assuming that you know absolutely nothing, and it works up from there. So in that course, I go through this in a lot more detail. I also break this down much more, and I give you specific exercises you can do so that you can really understand what every aspect of the triangle is doing for you and how you can start to make use of it. And the reason that I do that, and the reason that I'm doing this podcast on this particular subject, is that I believe this is probably the most important aspect of photography that you can learn. And the reason I say that is that if you know it, you open up the full creative potential of your camera, of your imagination, and you can start creating amazing results. If you don't know it, you're always in auto. You will not be able to get out. You'll never be able to get the results you want, or it'll be hit and miss. You're going to struggle if you look at other people's work, maybe other photographers that you want to produce the same kind of results. You're going to struggle to understand what it is they did if you don't understand this. And it's a bit like driving a car and not being able to, whether it's an auto or a stick shift or whatever, but you're just getting from A to B. You're not having any fun with it particularly. So, as I've said, you've got the three variables. You've got your shutter speed, you've got aperture, which is how wide the hole is, if you like, the light is coming through in the lens. So your lens includes elements inside, and they will open or close a bit like the iris of your eye. When you're in bright light, your iris will close down to restrict the amount of light coming in. And when you're in a low light environment or at night, your iris will open up. So that's exactly what's going on in the lens on your camera. You've effectively got an iris there. Obviously, the implementation is slightly different to your eye, but it amounts to the same thing. When it's open, you have a lot of light coming in, and when it's closed down, you have a lot less light coming in. But there is another element that influences your results. And then the final thing is ISO. So I mentioned that's the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera if you're using a digital camera or if you're using film. And that does seem to be making a bit of a comeback. And this is also relevant, actually, if you're switching from digital to film. If you don't understand this relationship, you'll probably struggle a little bit more. So it's the sensitivity to light of the film, and that's measured in ISO. And basically, the bigger the number, the more sensitive the film or the sensor is to light. So, for example, if you had an ISO of 100, that's not particularly sensitive. You would tend to use that kind of a setting in good lighting conditions where it's quite bright light. And if you're using an ISO of 8,000, really sensitive, you would tend to use that in very low light situations. Now, what I've said is correct as far as it goes, but there's actually a bit more to it than that. And that's what I really want to briefly cover in this podcast. But I do really urge you to make sure you understand it. And the best way to understand it is to go out and vary these settings and see what the effect is. And that's one of the exercises in the course that I have. So it takes you through step by step with each one of them and gives you practical exercises so that you can really go beyond a kind of theoretical understanding of it to just knowing it. And it's like driving a car. You can probably, before you learn to drive, you might have had a theoretical knowledge of how you drove a car, but you didn't really learn how to drive a car until you started doing it. And driving a car is all about getting out there, practicing, making mistakes, getting better at it, and that kind of thing. That's exactly what we do in photography. So just to dive in slightly deeper on each of those elements. So shutter speed. The measure I give, or just the suggestion I give, is shutter speed you want to vary for one of two things. Either it's to compensate for either a low light or a lot of light. So remember, what this exposure triangle is trying to give you is a correctly exposed image. That's what we're going for here. And when you're in auto mode, the camera will decide, based on how it's been calibrated, what a good exposure looks like, and it will set those things up for you normally. Or you'll have a default ISO setting. If you're using film, you have to actually tell the camera what ISO you've got on the older ones. I think some of the later film cameras could read it off film. None of the ones I use could do that, but some could do that. But the bottom line is, if you're using film, you probably need to tell the camera what you've got. And if you're using a camera, a digital camera, then the camera will just have default settings that it will run with. And it will then vary things as it needs to. Generally, it will be shutter speed and aperture, if it has control over aperture, to get a correct exposure for you. So again, these are variables. So how does it work? Well, with shutter speed, as I've said, you're going to be varying that for one of two things. One is the amount of light you've got, and the other thing is how much movement you want in the photograph. So, for example, shooting wildlife, if I'm photographing a humpback whale breaching, I'm in a situation where the animal is moving, I'm on a boat, that's probably moving, I'm probably moving, because generally with breaches, unless you're very lucky or you have a good view of where the animal's coming up, you can't see where it's about to come out. So it all happens very quickly. So I want a very fast shutter speed because my aim in that situation is to absolutely freeze that moment, just freeze that moment in time, freeze it to the point where you can see individual water droplets coming off the whale. So given that everything is moving, I'm talking about thousandths of a second. That's the kind of shutter speed I want. However, there might be other situations where I've got action going on, but I want some movement in it. And that might be sports photography. I used to do it a lot when I was photographing. I did some photographing of racing cars. I've also done it with aeroplanes, particularly propeller-driven aeroplanes. And my go-to shutter speed there was 1/125th of a second. So we're now talking hundredths of a second, and you can kind of pick what you need in there. But what I would be doing would be panning with either the aircraft or the car and trying to keep the subject, so the aircraft or the car, it might even be the driver, in exactly the same spot in the viewfinder as I'm panning, as I'm turning. And I'm using the motor drive, I'm shooting away. But at that shutter speed, because things like wheels or propellers are going to be moving pretty fast, you're going to get blurring. And you're probably going to get blurring of the background as well. So all of that, if you get it right, if everything comes together, you've got a pin-sharp driver or pilot, or even the vehicle they're in is pin-sharp, but you've got movement behind. You've got a blurry background, you've got wheels maybe that are blurred, or you've got a propeller disc. So if that's your priority, if it's about getting movement in the image, then shutter speed is most important to you. So that's going to drive the other settings. And obviously there's a bit more to it than that, but for the purposes of this, just to give you a brief introduction, this is how it works. Aperture is the next thing to think about. And as I've said, that works like an iris. So again, just like shutter speed, you may determine your aperture based on the amount of light you have. So basically, if you've got a lot of light, you might want to stop down or make the iris really small. So you'd have a number like an f/22. Or if there's not much light, you probably want to open it up as much as you can. And that will depend on the lens. It might be something like f5.6 or it might be f2.8. So basically, the smaller that number is after the f, the bigger the aperture, basically, the bigger the hole in the lens, if you like, the more light can come through. But just like with shutter speed, it's not a single variable there. You've got another thing that is directly impacted by aperture, and that's how much of the photograph is in focus. And that focus area is determined by two things: your aperture and then the distance that your subject is from you, or to be more precise, from the camera, the sensor in the camera or the film plane. And you might even, depending on what camera you've got, you might even see a mark on the top of your camera, just a line. Sometimes there might be a little circular symbol with it, something like that. That actually shows the plane of the film or the sensor, so where that is, because for some types of photography, you need to make a pretty exact measurement and focus really precisely. So that focal distance to how far away your subject is from the camera is one factor. And then what the aperture will do, your aperture setting, will allow a certain amount of what's in front of the subject and a certain amount of what's behind the subject be in focus. And basically the way it works is that if you're using a number like f/22, so you might remember that the iris is really small, so there's not a lot of light coming in, so maybe bright light. With that kind of a setting, pretty much everything that you can see will be in focus. So most of what's in front of your subject will be in focus, and probably pretty much everything that's behind will be in focus as well. If, on the other hand, you open that iris up, if you open the lens up and you're using something like f5.6, what will happen then is that although you've got more light coming in, there'll be a much shorter distance in front of your subject that's in focus and a much shorter distance behind the subject that's in focus. So by understanding that and knowing how the aperture works in your lenses, that your lens and camera setup, you can create these shots where you've got a very sharp subject, but the foreground and the background are out of focus. So if you look at my work, particularly with land animals, you'll find that quite a lot of them are shot that way. And I control that by using aperture as my primary setting. So when I'm doing that kind of photography, what's in focus is the thing that's most important to me. So that's two elements. Then the final thing is ISO, and as I've said, that determines just how sensitive to light either your film or your sensor is, and I've already explained that. So the way these things work is that you need to practice this, because I honestly, people like me, so I'm not very good at imagining how stuff like this works. I've got to see it. I'm much better at learning by seeing things, and I learn even more by actually doing it. So this is why I recommend, if you don't understand this, just getting on, doing a course somewhere, whether it's mine or somebody else's, but somewhere where you get guidance and exercises you can get guided through, where you really get this. You go through each element in turn and you start to understand it. So, as I've said, the key thing is to get the correct exposure. So you can do this fully manually, and if you're using a manual camera, you have to think about this stuff all the time anyway, because you have to manually make all of your settings, your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. However, if you go to most modern cameras, I'm going to say most because there might be an exception, but it's probably all of them, you will have what we call modes. And I've already talked about one mode, and if you've not really experimented with this, there's one mode you're probably using at the moment, and that's auto. That's the green one. Usually you'll have a little dial or a menu somewhere, and one of the options will be auto. And then the other options that you see will include, but not necessarily be limited to, some form of shutter speed priority. So in a Canon, you'll actually see that as TV. It's time variable, time variance. You might have aperture in some form. So again, on a Canon, it's AV, so aperture, variable, variance. You will also have fully manual, so just an M. And you're also likely to have B. And B stands for bulb. So, as I said, you might have others, but the ones that I'm really interested in here, if you want to really learn it, the thing to do is go to manual and really get good at it. But I'd say if you're not familiar with this stuff and you've only ever used auto, just use one at a time. And as I say, go through guided exercise, because if you go straight into manual, you've got to think of everything. And it's, in my opinion, it's probably a bit much, at least to start with. But, graduate up to using manual and just setting everything yourself once you understand it and you understand how it works on the particular system you're using. The settings I use, so these are the modes basically, and the idea of the modes is that modern cameras are pretty smart. You've got a pretty nifty computer in there, and it can do an awful lot of the heavy lifting for you. So, and that's essentially what it's doing when you're in auto. It's just deciding everything. The problem is when you're in auto, you've kind of given up your creative control to the camera, and the camera doesn't really know what you want as a result. So if you are in a situation where you do want a subject that's sharp and the foreground and background out of focus, especially the background, the chances are in auto you're not likely to get that. The camera is likely to set you with an aperture, because that's remember that's controlling depth of field, that has a lot of things in focus, maybe everything in focus, because it doesn't know what you're trying to achieve. And the same with shutter speed. It will look for a balance somewhere between probably a mid-range aperture setting, because for certainly cheaper lenses, they tend to perform a little bit better in the central kind of settings. That's likely to be f8 or f11. Now, I will say as an aside, I'm throwing these numbers out. You don't have to remember them, because what will happen is as you start to do these exercises with the camera, certain numbers are going to become familiar to you. And I've done another podcast on buying a lens, and I also talk about what those lenses mean. What those numbers mean, because you'll see them on the lens. So don't worry too much about those right now. The thing is to just stick the dial somewhere in the middle if you've got a dial on your lens where you set the aperture, or it might be that you rotate a switch somewhere on the camera body and it's handled that way. So that's how they're the three things you need to think about. And I briefly touched on the modes. And one of the fallacies that I've heard people talk about is that professional photographers only ever operate in manual. Well, I don't know many who do. If you are using manual, you're probably in a studio because you've got lots of time to get setups and measure how far away you are from your subject, if that's what you want to do, all that kind of stuff. And you've probably got a lighting setup that gives you very predictable lighting results. You're not having to deal necessarily, or certainly in the studio, you're not having to deal with clouds covering the sun and then going away again, or driving between trees on a bright day where you've got a very strong distinction between bright light areas where the sun comes through and then very dark areas where you've got shade. So if you've been taking photographs for a while, or if you're planning to take photographs, obviously these are variables that you have to deal with when you're taking your photographs. So it's not just making one setting normally on a particular day. If you're out photographing on a day where the sun's changing, as in clouds coming over and disappearing again, or you're at a time of day where the light level is changing, so typically that's just after dawn and just before dusk, those are times when you've really got to keep making adjustments for the amount of light that is on your subject when you take the shot. So I'm not trying to put you off here, but these are the realities of it. And also this is why it's so important, in my opinion, to really understand this relationship. And you do that by practice. So I'm just conscious the more I talk about it, the more complicated it starts to sound, but it really isn't. So the key thing is to just understand what each of those parts of the triangle do, what each side does. The next thing is to understand that on the camera, there's something there to help you. So when I'm shooting, when I'm photographing land animals, because I'm more interested in depth of field, I will use AV. So aperture is my priority. It's an aperture priority setting. And I've already set my ISO. I do that manually on my cameras. So what the camera will do is just change the shutter speed to make sure that I can get a good exposure with the aperture setting that I've chosen. And that's the key thing. So my creative control when I'm shooting that image is the depth of field. In other words, what's in focus in that frame and what isn't. And that's quite deliberate because it's part of, if you've heard me talk about just how you composition of an image, depth of field is one of the important elements of it. So once you understand and you can use depth of field, it does open up a lot of creative potential for you. Occasionally, so it would be situations like the humpback whale that I spoke about when it's breaching, I'll actually switch so that I've got shutter speed priority because I want to specifically shoot in thousandths of a second, because what I'm aiming to do when I shoot an animal like that is to just absolutely freeze the action. And in that situation, the other thing to consider is I'm out at sea. I might have nothing in the background, or I might have cliffs in the background, things like that. But the chances are that the aperture, the depth of field, so my aperture setting is less important from a depth of field perspective than it is from getting the correct exposure. So maybe opening up the aperture so that I can sit with that very fast shutter speed, because obviously the faster your shutter speed, the more ambient light you need. Otherwise, you're having to open up the aperture just to compensate for lack of light. So in other words, you're much more likely to be able to use a very high shutter speed where you have bright light on a bright summer's day than if you're at dusk. Then you're going to struggle because you've got to really push up your ISO. Now, the thing I haven't really spoken about is ISO. There's likely to be a program mode, something like that on your camera, which where you would control it usually with ISO. What does it matter where your ISO is set to? It could be 100, it could be 4,000, it could be anything. It could be either side of that or somewhere in the middle. Why does it really matter? Well, the thing you have to remember is that when you are using a high ISO, So when you're in the hundreds and thousands, as you move up in that direction, what happens is the sensor or the film is more sensitive. And what I'm going to talk about actually applies more to digital cameras. So if you're using a DSLR or mirrorless camera, as you push that ISO up, what happens is the sensor gets more sensitive, but it will also begin to pick up, we'll call it noise, and it gets picked up by heat from the sensor itself and the heat that's generated within the camera. Now, this isn't the kind of heat that's going to warm you up on a cold day, but because we're talking about very sensitive electronics here, it is the kind of levels of heat that as you push that ISO up, as you push the sensitivity of the sensor up, it will begin to appear in the image. And how it appears is like little pixels, little squares in the picture, and lots of them. And where you're likely to notice them much more is when you have a single color. So let's say you're photographing the sky and it's, let's say it's blue, just for the sake of argument, and you've pushed your ISO up really high so you can get a very, very fast shutter speed. What you like to see in that sky, because let's say it's a uniform blue, is a lot of little dots. They're very, very small, but they're going to be there. And that's noise, basically. That's generated within the camera. So the golden rule when it comes to using ISO, if you don't want the noise, and obviously noise might be something that you want. This is about creating images that float your boat, and you might like really noisy images. But if you don't, the trick there is to just keep that ISO as low as you can get away with, because that reduces the amount of noise in the image. And it's the same with film. So if you are using film, if you have a slow ISO, so something like ISO 100 is a very good general purpose film. Even ISO 400 is getting a bit fast. If you want to do a really high res sharp image, you might even consider an ISO 64 or an ISO 50 or even an ISO 25, depending on what light you've got. And if you think of, this is going back to film days, but magazine images, that first of all, magazine front covers particularly would tend to be shot on a medium format camera. And the benefit of that is it gives you really big negatives. So the enlargement you have to do from the size of the negative up to the printed image is smaller than if you're going from 35mm. But that would typically be shot on a very low ISO rated film, because that gives you very sharp, very high resolution. On the other hand, and I've done this deliberately, I've gone up with very fast films up in, I think, like 2000s, that sort of speed. These are quite specialist films, and they give you a really grainy result. And, you know, this is the whole point of it. If you like grainy images, then knock yourself out, but this is how you get them. So coming back to understanding this stuff, this is really the point of it. It's understanding how you get certain results by setting your camera. And most of those settings, not all of them, but most of them are likely to revolve around understanding the exposure triangle. So understanding the function of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and how they work together so that you can produce a result that gives you perhaps the amount of blur in it that you want, the amount of grain in it that you want, and that you can actually see the image because there's enough light reaching the sensor of the film. And as I've said, the benefit that we have these days with modern cameras is with the modes, and this is also true on film cameras actually to an extent, but I think on digital it's far more the case now because there's a much higher level of control generally on modern cameras than you had in old film cameras. But you've got these modes that you can choose from. So once you understand that, first of all, learn the exposure triangle, understand the basics, and then go back to the modes and experiment with them so that you can see exactly what the camera's doing. But this is really fundamental because if you want to shoot wildlife especially, or sport, or some sort of adventure activity, the chances are you are going to want to get a bit creative. You're not going to want to shoot in auto. But before you can switch auto off and select a different mode, you've really got to understand what it's doing. So look, I hope that's been helpful. I hope that shed a little bit of light, and I hope I haven't completely baffled you now. As I said at the start, what I absolutely recommend is that you you do some training. This, I think, is the best way of doing it. Find someone who can explain it to you in a way that you can understand. That's really important. You're welcome, as I say, to sign up for my course. I think it's understandable. And I think the most important thing, though, is to have guided exercises that you can go through that take you through each aspect of the exposure triangle so you can do it. You can see the difference when you change settings, so you can begin to predict what's going to happen when you change a setting when you're shooting for real, when you're whether it's shooting wildlife or on a holiday or whatever you're doing. So that is it on the exposure triangle and modes. As I say, I hope that's been useful, and hopefully that's given you some insights or some clarity, and I'll speak to you on the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and just one more thing before you go. Just remember to drop any comments that you have or questions, and I'll get back to them in a future podcast. And remember that there's a new podcast every Friday. So if you've enjoyed this one, please remember to like and subscribe, and join me on my mailing list, and you'll get a heads up about the latest podcast. So bye for now.